Hi, everyone. We're just going to give it one more minute, see if anybody else joins, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, thanks for joining today's DaCCoTA core training event. My name is Miranda Ryder. I am also joined by Cassie Gary and Savannah Macias Doherty. Sorry, Savannah. Our presentation today is on things to consider with project and application development. Next slide, Cassie. Can you go to the next slide, Cassie? Thank you. So just a quick overview of what we'll touch base on today. So we're going to go over some items that are needed for each of your applications to DaCCoTA as well as NIH. We're going to go over any approvals that you will need to obtain during your project and application development. You'll have to do certain trainings, things to consider when you're doing human subject studies and what you might need to take into consideration. We'll go over some cost and budget items. We'll discuss the different study team members' roles and titles, communication and time considerations that you should take into account when you're developing. Next slide, please. And I will give it to Savannah.
All right, thank you, Miranda. And so the first issue that I want to bring up that not everyone knows about when submitting to the DaCCoTA is that you will actually be submitting multiple versions of your grant application. Once you have a letter of intent accepted by the DaCCoTA, you will then be invited to submit a complete grant application. And this is really your initial version of the application. This comes to the DaCCoTA. And then there are multiple rounds of review, which may include some revisions on your part. And then you'll submit a final version of your application to NIH. And these two versions of your application are also going to include different components. And so I want to explain those on the next slides. So in terms of applying to the DaCCoTA, a lot of the core components will be the same between the DaCCoTA and NIH. And those include PHS 398 forms, and I'll go into a little more depth of those on the next slide. And then you have your biosketches, your research plan, you have consortium and contractual arrangements, you have your letters of support, and these come from various different sources, like your department head or clinical chief and other participating members of your research project. And then each DaCCoTA core after your core meetings. And these are required core meetings that you'll have once you're in development of a complete application. And then you have resource sharing plans, authentication of key biological and chemical resources, a DaCCoTA human subjects overview checklist. This will state where in the IRB process you are. A community engagement relevance survey. This is new this year. This is just a checklist survey that says what communities your research is relevant to. And these are communities that are identified by the CEOC of the DaCCoTA. And then you have the PHS 398 checklist, and this is from NIH. And what you'll notice is that quite a few of these are only included if applicable to your project. And that's determined if you have human subjects, if you have clinical trials, if you have vertebrate animals. And a lot of this is also determined as you're working with the DaCCoTA and your project teams. And we'll go to the next slide. So the PHS 398 forms are standardized forms that come from NIH, and you have a face page. This includes a lot of overview information, like the PI of the project, some budget information, institutional information, of course, your project title. And then you start to become a little more detailed in these pages. You have your summary, relevance, project performance sites. You list all of your key personnel and significant contributors. You go into your budget as well, and then a detailed budget justification. And these forms are all available on NIH's site that is also listed on this next slide. So this link at the top of this slide is where you can find downloadable instructions and downloadable and blank files of all of these forms. They're in a Word format and PDF format. And we'll go more into the importance of the downloadable instructions a little bit later, but this is really where you want to go to get those forms for your application. Next slide. And then just a little overview of what your research plan entails. You have different components, like a response to review, only if this is a resubmission of your project. And then you have specific aims, significance, innovation, research strategy. This is the meat of your research plan. This is where you're really going to go into all of the context of your project and your research and your experiments. Then you have your bibliography, and if applicable to your project, a vertebrate animal section where you go more in depth of your processes for experimentation with animals. Next slide. So now those were the components that are required just for that initial submission to the DaCCoTA. And then in the process of those multiple reviews, you'll then also receive help to gather the rest of the components necessary for submitting to NIH. And I know this slide right now looks busy, but if we go to the next slide, I'd like to highlight what is different between your application for the DaCCoTA and now NIH. So your research plan changes a little bit. You now have an introduction that is really a response to review for the secondary and tertiary reviews that you get. And then you have EAC approval letters, if applicable to your project, IACUC, IRB, IBC approvals. And then again, if applicable to your project with human subjects or vertebrate animals, you have specific education courses and trainings that are required, and these come from the city program, and these are for all of the key personnel on your project. And then you have human subjects and clinical trial paperwork. And next slide. So I said I was going to come back to those downloadable instructions that are on that link that I posted before, but I posted the link again here. This is the PDF form of the downloadable instructions provided by NIH. These I feel are crucial, especially if you are new to writing NIH grant applications. They provide very detailed, very thorough, step-by-step instructions for filling out those PHS forms, and even beyond that, it includes some information about biosketches, about your letters of support, and especially I feel that for new investigators, budget can also be an issue, determining what needs to be in that budget, and these forms go through that very well, especially for NIH's budget forms, which can be different from different agencies. And next slide. So I just wanted to bring up an example of those step-by-step instructions that are provided in that guidebook. I just really want to emphasize how useful this guidebook is. And so this is for that form page 1, that face page. It's the very front of your grant application. And if Cassie could just click once for me. So one of the first things is it states which form is used for this section. So this face page, it is form page 1, and it has a hyperlink to bring up that form for you. And next, click. And then it also walks through each box or field of those forms. So the title of the project correlates to box 1 of that form, and so on and so forth. And next, click. It'll also include details on formatting. So there's not much guesswork involved for what needs to go in all of these boxes and how it should be formatted as well. And next, click. And then it also includes other important requirements or information like this face page. Something that can easily be overlooked or skipped is that it needs to be signed by an official signing person designated from your applicant organization. And so I use these guidebooks a lot, just for looking over applications, making sure they are complete. And so I think that is very helpful for going through all of these forms that are required for the DaCCoTA and then for NIH.
All right. Here are all the approvals that you'll need for your project. We'll start with the IRB. Depending on if your project involves human subjects or not, if you are only doing animal research and it does not involve human subjects, you'll want to get the human subjects determination letter. If it is determined that you are involving human subjects, then you'll want to move on to your IRB application. I will go over that in a little more detail on the next slide, but that's just going to include everything, all the information about your project. Next, you will have your protocol. Most of that information you can get from the IRB application, but you'll have to develop a protocol for your project. The IRB has a lot of templates that you can use though to develop that. So if you just check with your institution's IRB, or if you always want to use the IRB that the activities will take place at. So if it's like a Sanford facility, then we will use the Sanford IRB. And then next you'll need your informed consent. These documents, you should have them written in very plain language. They want them to be generally at an 8th grade reading level, and you want to tailor the document to the study population and avoid technical jargon and complex terms. You'll just want to use straightforward language that is understandable by everyone. And then if you're going to have any recruitment materials, anything that you are going to give to patients has to be IRB approved. Next, you're going to want to do your IBC application. The purpose of the IBC is just to ensure protection from any possible exposure to biohazardous materials. So it's required for all genetic engineering and any institution that is receiving NIH funding, even if the proposed work is not funded by the NIH. So you'll submit your application and it'll go through a staff review, will be sent back for any clarifications. And then after that has been met, then it'll go before a review board. And then they'll send you a letter for that approval. So I put some estimated timelines on there just because these can take quite a while, a lot longer than some people think. And then too, if you have any comments that you need to address, then it kind of goes back and forth and takes even longer. Next, you will need your IACUC approval. This is required for anyone that is using animals. So all research, teaching, and training. And if you are working with animal carcass, biospecimen, or invertebrates, then you'll need an exemption. So you'll still have to apply for that exemption. And then also just wanted to note for your IBC approval and your IACUC approval, you will want to get those wherever that the activities are going to take place. So these may be separate approvals at different institutions. So these are the trainings that you will need. City training is good for 3 years, and then after that, you'll just have to take a renewal course, and then that will be good for another 3 years. If your project involves human subjects, you'll have to take the human subjects training. It can take up to 4 hours to complete, and then you'll have to do the biomedical and GCP course, which can take another 3 to 6 hours. If you need IACUC approval, you'll have to take the animal care and use courses, and that can take up to 3 hours to complete. And these must be completed before you submit your IRB and IACUC application. And these also will be required for anyone that is going to be involved with the study. You don't necessarily have to do it before you submit your application to NIH, except for the key personnel, but the other people that are involved will have to complete it before we can open the study. So this slide is just talking about just things that you need to think about when you're developing your application to the IRB. First, you'll want to look at your study rationale and the investigators that are going to be involved, and what the investigators' qualifications are to conduct the trial. Next, you'll want to think about what population that you will need for your project. Are there certain ages that you're targeting, and where will your study activities all take place? You'll want to think about your inclusion and exclusion criteria. You'll want to think about what you're going to collect from participants. Are you going to collect something like blood, tissue, sputum, or are you having them complete a questionnaire or interviews? Are you asking them to wear a device or take investigational products? And then next, you'll want to think about what data that you need for your project and where you will be storing that data. And also another thing, if you're going to do any future research on that project. And then, is it going to be a multi-site research? You can recruit from, so like, let's say it's Stanford, you can recruit from different locations. That's not considered multi-site. Multi-site is when you're involving other institutions. So like Stanford and Avera or Ultru. So then that would be considered multi-site research. And then some of the human subjects components to think about to kind of help us work through the workflows would be how often do you need the data? Are you going to be collecting it after each patient, or is it okay to send the data at the end of the study? If you're collecting frozen tissue, do you want it fresh or do you want it frozen? The same with like blood. Do you need the blood processed or do you just want whole unprocessed blood? And then will you be picking up the specimen from the institution or do we need to ship it via FedEx to you?
So a few other things that you should take into consideration with your project development and your grant application earlier in the development process include costs and budgets. The first mechanism to go through is how are you going to fund this study? Are you going to apply for a grant mechanism, or do you have institutional money? On here, I do have listed the different grant opportunities. that are available through DaCCoTA. So knowing which grant you would be interested in applying for that would fit the type of project you are aiming to do is important because each of them have different dollar amounts provided. So knowing how much you're going to be given and what you're aiming to do within that dollar amount is very critical. Similarly, if your project is involving either another institution, so including a subaward, or is including human subjects clinical costs, that's another component you'll have to factor in. For clinical costs associated with human subject studies, there's a lot more to be considered that can affect how much money you'll have left over. You have to look at all of the personnel that is going to be necessary to help obtain those human subject components. You'll have to think of specimen processing, shipping needs, as well as costs. If you're going to obtain specimens, sometimes you may have to buy that. Other costs for clinical could include, are you giving patients any money, or, you just have to think of everything that might cost money throughout your project and make sure that however you're funding the study is sufficient. Next slide, please. Another big one that I think, and all of these slides kind of aren't included in your project and application, but highly affect the outcome of your project and application. So looking at the time consideration. So from the beginning through when you're ready to open a study, everything can take more time than anticipated. That includes finding a collaborator if you're applying for a DaCCoTA grant, finding somebody who can assist you to operationalize your project and your grant, and making sure that they have the qualifications and the abilities to do so. Really developing your project components. So like Cassie was talking about, all of those approvals you'll need take more time. And so always getting started on these things earlier in the development process will make everything run much more smoothly. And if you do encounter hiccups, you will be able to sort those out within a timely manner before too late. Your budget takes some time, especially if you're developing a budget with another institution or clinical costs, and you have to wait for those ones to come in to actually develop the rest of yours. Like Cassie said, there are trainings that are required depending on what your study looks like. Those all take a lengthy amount of time, and they are needed in order to proceed with other aspects of your application and your project. As you near an application with NIH, there's other components that Savannah was going over that need to then be included. This includes human subjects paperwork. All of that can take a while to develop and then get submitted. So taking that into consideration earlier, so you can be prepared when that time comes. Similarly, your approvals take quite some time to get approved. Next slide, please. So going a little bit more into depth into your study team, the titles, who's considered key personnel. So position titles, as you work through the grant development process, you'll hear multiple different types of principal investigators. There's the grant PI. So that is the individual who is actually submitting that grant application. They're the one comprising it and then going to be given that award. There is also a protocol PI. This is the principal investigator in terms of the human subject's eyes. They are in the IRB's perspective. This is the individual who's responsible for that human subject's protection wherever those human subjects components are happening. This may not always be the same person as the grant PI. So don't get confused by multiple PI versions. While there is only one for the grant and only one for the IRB, they could or could not be the same person. More along the lines of your grant application, identifying when to call people a co-I or a co-PI. In terms of the DaCCoTA grant mechanisms, there is only one PI. No co-Is are allowed for the DaCCoTA projects and should be included. So just that one grant applicant should be that PI. All other collaborators or key personnel would be listed as co-investigators. Moving along to your key personnel, then not all individuals who will be working on that study are considered key personnel. Only the following individuals should be considered key personnel when you're identifying percentages, costs, and listing them for the NIH. This includes your clinician, non-clinician collaborator, You may have more than one or just one, or any mentors that you might have assisting you with that project. But project managers, DaCCoTA staff assisting, graduate students, clinical coordinators, none of those personnel are listed. None of those people are listed as key personnel when it comes to your grant application. I will put a side note in here, even though they're not considered key personnel to the grant mechanism, any person touching, working on, or viewing data on a project do need to be listed with the IRB. So just a little difference there. So when you're looking at personnel, make sure you clearly know there's a difference between the grant mechanism versus an IRB or study. Next slide, please. Communication. Communication is huge when you're developing a grant application or a project. So knowing who to communicate with and when you should communicate with those individuals. So just some different examples here to keep in mind as you're developing your projects. So the grant mechanism core. So this would be either the pilot projects core or the professional development core of DaCCoTA. These individuals who are releasing the RFAs and who receive your applications and can assist with finalizing them and getting them fully submitted. It is good to know to communicate with these individuals when you have any updates to your grant application, your budget changes at all, or if your project were to change in any format. These are also great people to reach out to if you have questions about your grant or DaCCoTA in general. Another person to consider communicating with is your project manager. If you have a project manager working on you with your study, being in frequent communication with them is key. So giving them any updates that you have to your grant application or your grant funding or budgeting. If you have any changes to your overall project, so that includes any changes to your approvals or to the workflows, processes, or what you're actually doing within your project. Updating them on anything that changes within your human subjects components, or even telling them if any of your study team members change in any capacity. Another person to consider would be your collaborator, clinician or non-clinician collaborator. So they do need to be communicated with when there's ever any changes to your grant or your project in any format, and then any changes or updates when you are going to publish. And the last kind of important person to make sure you communicate with throughout your development would be your grant administrator at your institution. They are very helpful in terms of getting your grant all put together and submitted, and then assisting with any budgets. Likely you will have to go through your grants office at whatever institution you are submitting through. So they should be communicated with and kept up to date as you're working on that process. Next slide, please. So that's kind of a quick overview that we had for really key things to consider as you're developing and organizing your grant application and project. We'll now open it to any questions if anybody has any.
Hi, Miranda.
Hi.
Hi. So good to be here. Great information there. And I think I'll be diving back into the PowerPoint in the next few days to get more specifics. But I did have, maybe this is a very specific question. In terms of budgeting with collaborators, I have one collaborator that will be helping administer a tool and has expertise in bioinformatics and computer science that I'll never have. And that to run that part of the project will take part of his team as well. And I'm wondering, how is that considered in budgeting in terms of what is allowable and not allowable expenses for collaborators?
Yeah, so I might have to pass over to Savannah to what's allowable and not allowable, but I can quickly speak on the cost that you might have with that collaborator kind of helping you with that mechanism. They would be able to draft some sort of budget of what it would cost from their institution and then provide that to you, which you would incorporate into your overall budget that you would submit to DaCCoTA. Again, maybe Savannah, do you have a little more insight to what's allowable and not allowable for budgets?
from what I've seen, and this may require just looking more into those that guidebook, because it does go a bit more into budgets, especially when you're involving multiple institutions. I do know that each institution needs to have their own budget form. But from what I've seen, you should include all personnel and their salaries if they have them, but you should also include them if they are not being supplied a salary. And there is room for itemized equipment and other supplies as well. So I'm imagining that, and again, I'd have to look more into the specifics, but I'm imagining that a lot of that equipment from the different collaborators is mostly allowable, and I have not seen much restrictions in terms of that, especially if it's being used towards your project and towards your experiments.
Wonderful. So, and in terms of, is there some salary expense of collaborators allowed, let's say a summer stipend, or would that be more on a consulting kind of hourly basis?
I am attempting to pull it up very quickly. I just have it bookmarked on my own web pages.
And maybe this would be beneficial to know, our next month's training is actually on grant budget development. So a lot of those questions may be able to be answered with September's core training event as well.
Sure, I realize these are very specific questions,
Yeah,
so I can
no.
hold on that.
Yes, and I'm not seeing very many restrictions in terms of collaborators, especially for personnel. It wants you to include all collaborating investigators, individuals in training, support staff, whether or not their salary is requested. And at least for that salary, I'm not seeing restrictions on consultants specifically. There's even a section that dives into consultant costs and how to calculate that.
Okay, and this, but in this case, though, I guess I would list him as a collaborator since he is involved in administering the project, helping with that. So I guess that would probably be better designation than consultant in this case. But yeah, I may have a consultant as well, so that's great.
Yeah, I say a lot of this also goes involved with the people that you're working with to develop your project team and who's specifically going to be taking on what roles, and then therefore what their project title should be. And that'll impact kind of how you look at their salaries and list their salaries in your budget.
Excellent. Thank you.
Does anybody else have any other questions? Or want us to elaborate on anything that we maybe have touched on? Cassie, can you go to the next slide, please? So just some more information. We do have these core training events every month. They are given by either a different core of the DaCCoTA or a combination of on various topics that we think can be educated or can assist applicants and awardees. So if you think of any topics that could be discussed or given an education on, please feel free to reach out to any of the listed core coordinators with DaCCoTA, and we can put that on our agenda to present on that topic and to give some more background information.
Fantastic.
So if there's no other questions, I do believe this presentation was recorded and we can make that available as well for people to re-listen to and to go through. Thank you for attending.
Fantastic. Thanks, Miranda. Hey, quick question. Where would we find that link for the PowerPoint and recording? Is that just, would that be on the Pathfinder?
I do believe we'll list that on the DaCCoTA website somewhere. I might have to defer that to the core coordinator who kind of assists us with getting these uploaded there. But when that's sent out, I'd be happy to share that with you, Dr. Freeman.
Cool, thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good Wednesday.
Thank you.
So I think I'll follow up with Mark and see where he's going to share this at. Okay. Thanks, Savannah.